The fall garden is in full swing, so I thought I would show you around. Just like any season, I've had some hits and some misses with the fall garden, but also just like any season, even the misses offer opportunity for learning and growth. Most of my fall garden is here on my back patio. I've found over the years that I particularly enjoy having fall and winter crops handy right outside my door. We'll start by exploring around here with lettuce, greens, and fall potatoes mostly, before we walk out into the big garden where I can give you an update on my carrots, beets, broccoli, and cabbage. Let's start out here with my main green stalk. This is my original 5-tier. I've been using this obviously all season, but a lot for fall crops already. You can see here that the first tier has lettuce. Now you'll notice this particular lettuce variety, this is red salad bowl. It actually bolted. I've never had lettuce bolt in the fall before, but we had unusually hot weather in September this year. In fact, at the end of September, we were still in the 90s when we're usually in the low 80s, and that caused this particular red variety to bolt. Thankfully, it's really the only one that has bolted. We've got this Muir lettuce here, which is kind of aging. I've been picking this for salads. These are definitely my older lettuce plants. I started them indoors in, I think, the middle or end of July, planted them out here in August, so they are definitely at maturity. With the second row, I've got a couple of succession plantings of arugula. You can see this one is probably what I just sowed a couple of days ago. This I sowed about 2 weeks ago, so it's coming along. I can go ahead and harvest this for baby arugula if I want to, or I can wait until it gets a little bit larger for more mature arugula. You can also see throughout these green stalk pockets, I have varying maturities of arugula, just because whenever I harvest arugula to eat, I immediately will plant a new planting. That way I can always have fresh greens. Most of it's arugula. I do have some mesclun greens and some greens mixes, but you can tell I love my arugula. I do have a couple of jalapeno plants and some basil. This is just because we haven't had our first frost yet. That should be coming anytime now. By the time you watch this, we may or may not have already had it. So once the frost kills this off, I'll take this out, plant more greens, and you can kind of see how that works. What we also have is fall potatoes. Now, if you remember from a previous video where I planted fall potatoes, I planted some fall potatoes here in the green stalk because it worked so well in my spring garden. You can check out this video to see about what that harvest was like, and I'm hoping to replicate it this time. The challenge with these potatoes in particular, especially this year, is that potatoes definitely need full sun, but when I planted them, it was still very hot in August and September, and so I found that they were searching for the sun, but also hot weather can cause the potatoes to become leggy. So they're not as bushy right now as they were in the spring planting when they had full sun and it wasn't so hot. I'll be interested to see how this affects the harvest, if we get a smaller harvest or what, but you can definitely tell a difference in the growth of these potatoes as compared to the spring planting. But overall, this particular green stalk I'm actually pretty happy with. I've been harvesting on it like I've shown you. Let's go ahead and take a look at the other green stalk, which is full of greens that I planted after these. And then I'll also show you the grow bag fall potatoes and you can compare how they look. Here I have my green stalk leaf planter. This is the 7-tier planter. I love planting greens in this green stalk. You can see here I've got some Monte Carlo lettuce at varying maturity. I think I planted these more mature ones a little bit earlier than the smaller ones. This one I think is starting to go to seed. It may have not handled that heat all that well, but for the most part they look good. This is the Muir lettuce. I love this lettuce. It is very crisp and it's very heat tolerant. That's why I planted it in the later part of the summer, because I knew it could handle the heat a little bit better. Typically Monte Carlo also handles the heat better, but I'm definitely seeing more resilience with this Muir. Below these lettuce tiers I have spinach, and I'm planting 2 different varieties of spinach this year. This one is the variety Lizard, and then this one is the variety Auric. Now I am noticing that there are a couple of spinach plants that have started to bolt. Again, I believe this is because of our heat, but anytime spinach gets stressed, they start to bolt. Hopefully we have a few here that have not bolted yet and they'll be able to make it through the fall, and I usually get my best spinach harvest after the winter has started to break into earlier spring. Like for me it'd be February. So we'll see how they do. This was definitely an experiment with testing a couple of different varieties. And then we have arugula down here. Of note is that the arugula and the spinach were planted on the same day. So you can see how much faster the arugula grows compared to the spinach. And obviously I could harvest this arugula whenever I want to. The plan will still be to, harvest the greens, replant, and just see how far I can get them to grow, especially now that we have our daylight so short. But so far, doing the succession planting of the lettuce and the greens has worked out really well. Now let's give you a look at the fall potatoes in the grow bags. Here I've got the potatoes that I planted in grow bags. I planted these on August 3rd, and here we are about 2.5 months later. These are growing really well. They just started flowering a couple of weeks ago. And I actually went on a trip to New York City for about a week, and this was the only thing I asked my husband to do. Everything else was on automatic irrigation, but I'm like, please keep my potatoes watered. So I ended up using this moisture meter for him, and I just told him to check it. If it's dry, water it. That was the week that we were in the 90s. In New York City, it was amazing. I'm like, this is why people in the Northeast love the fall. They actually got one, whereas we in the South were sweltering. But so far, these are looking really good. My only challenge is that we are pretty close to our average first frost date. The whole reason I'm growing these in grow bags is so that I can transfer them into the greenhouse if we do get a freeze. I can even heat the greenhouse if I want to. My hope is that they'll be able to get enough sun to be able to continue growing and continue developing their tubers. Just by the way that they look, I really think that this is promising. It's just a matter of time. Will I have enough time before the freezes get bad, before sunlight causes a problem? We'll see, but right now I'm very hopeful. All of these seed potatoes came from Wood Prairie Family Farm. I had ordered them right at the end of the season. Now they're taking orders for next year. So if you're looking for seed potatoes from Wood Prairie Family Farm, you can go ahead and start pre-ordering them now, even if you don't want them shipped till next year. The next thing I want to show you is this Birdie's raised bed. Sorry about how the shadows are casting, but this is a really good example of how I'm planning and planting in succession. So this one right here, you can see that there are some full-grown lettuce plants. Again, this is some of my earliest planted lettuce, but I've also got some greens that I sowed just a few days ago. My goal here is to be able to get as much as I can growing so that I can harvest for as long as possible. And then I'll be able to cover this if I need to, if we get a freeze. So you can just kind of see the rhythm that I'm going here, getting some early crops so that they are fully ready to harvest in October, and then having some that hopefully I can harvest throughout the year and into January if possible, just depending on how our winter goes. Before we walk out to the main garden, I wanted to answer a question I get asked a lot. When do you plan a fall garden? For me, planning my fall garden begins in January, when I plan my entire garden year. Sure, I revisit that plan in July typically, and I make some adjustments based on how many of these crops performed well in the spring, but planning ahead for the entire season makes executing that plan so much easier. I don't have to wonder, what am I going to plant? When will I plant? And I don't worry if I planted too late. This planning process of mine, I've developed into a step-by-step strategy that I teach in my online garden planning course, Dream to Garden. Hundreds of gardeners have gone through it and have been able to grow more food because they maximize every season, just like the fall. If you're a gardener who wants to get a handle on strategic planning so you can grow more, Dream to Garden is only open a few times per year, and if you're watching this live, it's open now. Students who take Dream to Garden in the fall find it a perfect time to get a jump start on garden planning. For more information and to join, go to this link. We'll also link it in the description. Here we are in the main garden, and if you recognize this garden space, this is where I planted my carrots. And if you watched this video, you saw that this bed is one I had trouble with the carrots germinating. Thankfully, as you can see, several of them ended up sprouting just fine, and I've got a bed that's maybe a third full compared to what I had planned. But honestly, I was just grateful after I had issues with the seeds germinating. So this is an update on that. If you notice another plant that doesn't look like a carrot, we've got some potatoes, and these are volunteer potatoes because I planted potatoes in this bed in the spring. I just thought, let's leave them here. I don't have a whole lot of carrots, and let's see how they do. I'm not too hopeful because it was just so late in the season. Maybe if I cover it in a freeze, it might give them a little bit of extra time, but it's definitely more than I would have had otherwise if I get any kind of harvest, and I'll be okay with that. Moving on from this bed, I'm going to share with you one of the major disappointments of this year's fall garden. This bed right here, I had anticipated to be full of beets. I pickle my own beets, so I grow both a spring crop and a fall crop to hopefully be able to have enough pickled beets to last all year. I eat them in my salads every day. I planted the beet seeds maybe a little bit later than I planted the carrots, and I planted them the exact same way that I planted them last year. I planted them under the cover of some watermelon vines here, and I had them irrigated with the Garden & Minutes garden grid, so I knew the soil was moist. But as of now, 2 months later, not a single beet seed has germinated. I'm still trying to figure out what the problem was. The only thing I could think of is it may have had something to do with the heat that we had had that time of year. We had a pretty big hot spell. Perhaps they either sprouted and just died off in the heat, or maybe the soil temperature was too high. I will say the same beets that I planted indoors and then transplanted out, they sprouted just fine. So I don't think it was the seed problem at all. But this was definitely a disappointing experience. One thing that I did learn with the beet planting process is a lesson that will really help me for next year. And that is I tried to plant beet seeds indoors. I've never really had great success with that, but I've seen so many gardeners that do. I decided to give it a shot again, and they actually did really well. I transplanted them into the Birdie's raised bed, but then right away they were devoured by the blister beetle. I really thought there was no way that they would come back, but they actually did come back. But since it was just a test and I only had a few, definitely not going to be enough for pickled beets. But I learned a lesson that I can take with me for next year, and particularly in the fall planting, if the soil temperature and heat was the biggest factor in this, is I can start beet seeds indoors. I can transplant them. They actually transplant better than I've had experience with in the past. So that was a lesson that I learned. It's not going to help me as far as having pickled beets to last me until next year's harvest in June, but it's a lesson nonetheless that hopefully it'll help me to be able to have better success with beets in the future. So these were my disappointments with a couple of my root crops, carrots and beets. Let's go take a look and see how the cabbage and the broccoli are doing. I still have my cabbage and my broccoli covered with this insect netting because we haven't had our first frost. I'll probably take it off about the time that we get our first expected freeze, and instead of the insect netting, if the freeze gets too much below 32 predicted, I'll probably transfer a floating row cover on top of this, especially the broccoli. And the cabbage is actually doing really well. It looks like there has been some insect damage, but not a whole lot. They're not really starting to head up yet, but that's completely normal. A lot of times I don't start getting my fall cabbage harvested until December, even early January. They can usually last that long. The broccoli is a little bit less cold hardy, so it will definitely harvest a little bit earlier. I usually get all my broccoli out of the garden by December at the latest, just depending on how the nighttime temperatures go. But if you watched this video on my seed starting issue, especially with broccoli, I am excited to share with you that they definitely came back when I planted them in the garden. They grew really fast, and as of this week they are starting to form heads. At least the first ones are, and then the other ones are not going to be far behind. So these are actually very much on track, and the insect netting has done better than it's ever done before. I've been so happy with this. There's been very few amount of pests that have been able to get in here. There's a little bit of damage, but nothing like I've had in the past, so I haven't had to spray anything on these. No major cabbage worm issues because of this insect netting. So I'm very grateful for that, and I'm very hopeful that I'll be able to get a full harvest of both cabbage and broccoli this fall. As you can see, I'm pretty happy with my fall garden, but I definitely have ways I can tweak my plan for next season. And just a reminder, if you want me to walk you through planning your 3-season garden, spring, summer, and fall, and depending on your climate, maybe even the winter, check out my online course, Dream to Garden, in the link below. And also, if you're wondering where my garlic is, because that's a fall crop, that will be planted very soon. Hopefully after our first frost kills the squash and zucchini that's behind me, but maybe even before in another bed. So stay tuned for that video. Make sure you subscribe to the channel, and I'll share that with you very soon.